Chapter 1. The Dream of the King. Before the marble rose from the sand, before the white columns caught the blinding fire of the North African sun, and long before the silence of the scrolls settled over the delta, there was only the wind. For thousands of years, the coast of Egypt, where the great river Nile surrenders its waters to the Mediterranean Sea, was a place of quiet solitude. It was a landscape of shifting dunes and salt marshes, inhabited only by the wading birds that stalked the shallows, and the few fishermen who cast their nets into the turquoise waves near the tiny, forgotten village of Rakotis. The wind here blew uninterrupted from the sea, carrying with it the scent of salt and ancient clay scouring the limestone ridges, whispering over a land that was waiting for a name. History, in its deepest sense, is often born in the quiet moments before the noise of construction begins. And the history of the Great Library, the single greatest repository of human thought the world has ever known, began not with a book, nor with a shelf, but with a dream in the mind of a sleeping king. The year was 331 BC. Alexander of Macedon, the young conqueror whose armies had swept across the known world like a wildfire across dry grass, had come to Egypt. He was a man driven by a restless, insatiable hunger, not merely for land, but for immortality. He sought to unite the East and the West, to bind the fractured cultures of the earth into a single, coherent whole. But on this particular night, the conqueror was at rest. Legend tells us that Alexander slept in his tent near the canopic mouth of the Nile. The camp was silent, save for the crackle of the watchfires and the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore. In the deep hours of the night, when the mind wanders into the territories of prophecy, Alexander had a vision. A man appeared to him, an old man with grey hair and a venerable countenance, standing in the grey mist of the dream. The figure spoke lines from the ancient poet Homer, lines from the Odyssey, reciting them in a voice that sounded like the ocean itself. There is an island, then, in the dashing sea, in front of Egypt. Men call it Pharos. Alexander awoke with the words echoing in the dark chamber of his mind. Pharos. He knew the name. It was a small limestone island just off the coast, a jagged rock protruding from the sea, desolate and uninhabited. But to Alexander, awake now in the pre-dawn light, it was more than a rock. It was the anchor point for a city that would eclipse all others. He rose before the sun. He gathered his architects, his engineers, and his generals, and he rowed out to the strip of land that lay opposite the island of Pharos. He stood on the limestone ridge, looking out over the empty sweep of the natural harbor. To any other man, it was a wasteland of scrub brush and sand. But Alexander possessed the gift of the architect. He could see the ghost of the future overlaid upon the present. He did not see the sand. He saw a metropolis. He saw wide, colonnaded avenues, oriented to catch the cool Etesian winds from the north. He saw a massive causeway connecting the island to the mainland, dividing the waters into two great harbors. He saw palaces, temples, gymnasiums, and markets where the spices of India would trade for the tin of Britain. And somewhere in that vision, perhaps only as a flicker of intuition, he saw the need for a mind to govern this body. A place where the wisdom of the Greeks could mingle with the ancient magic of the Egyptians. But there was a problem. In their haste to survey the site, the architects had forgotten to bring the chalk usually used to mark out the foundations of a city. They stood on the windswept dunes, ready to draw the lines of the future walls, but they had nothing to mark the earth with. Alexander, impatient and inspired, ordered his soldiers to bring the barley meal from the commissary, the flour intended to feed the army, He commanded them to pour the grain onto the ground, and so the first outline of Alexandria was drawn not in stone or blood, but in flour. They walked the perimeter, trailing the white powder behind them, tracing the shape of the future walls in the dark earth. Alexander designed the city in the shape of a chlamys, the Macedonian military cloak, broad in the center and tapering at the ends. It was a soldier's city, born from a soldier's mind. But as they finished the circuit, and the white lines of flour lay glowing in the morning sun, a shadow fell over the land. From the delta marshes and the sea cliffs, thousands of birds descended. Great flocks of waterfowl and smaller birds of the desert, attracted by the sudden feast of grain. They swooped down in a chaotic, fluttering cloud, covering the lines of the city. In minutes, the barley was gone. The outline of Alexandria had been eaten. The engineers were terrified. They saw this as a terrible omen, a sign that the city would be consumed, that it would vanish as quickly as it was built. They urged the king to abandon the site. But Alexander turned to his seers, the interpreters of signs. The seers smiled. They told the king that he had misread the message. The birds were not destroyers. They were messengers. The consumption of the grain meant that this city would be a nurse to the world. It would feed the nations. It would be a place of sustenance, not just for the body, but for the spirit. It would provide resources for all men, from all corners of the earth. Alexander accepted this. He was satisfied. He gave the order to build. And then, as quickly as he had arrived, he left. The restless energy that drove him pushed him eastward, toward Persia, toward India, toward the edge of the map. He would never see his city built. He would never walk its paved streets or stand in the shadow of its white columns. He would die years later in a palace in Babylon, feverish and far from home. His body returned to Alexandria, only in a golden coffin filled with honey. But the dream did not die with the dreamer. The city rose. It rose with a speed and ferocity that startled the ancient world. It was not grown. It was manufactured. It was the first modern city, a grid of rationality imposed on the chaos of nature. The limestone was quarried, the marble was imported, and the white walls began to shimmer against the blue of the sea. Yet, a city is merely a shell until it has a soul. Alexandria was a center of trade, a center of power, a center of wealth, but it needed to be something more. It needed to be the memory of the world. Enter Ptolemy Pharca Soter. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, a man of keen intelligence and pragmatic ruthlessness. When Alexander died, and his empire was torn apart by his squabbling successors, Ptolemy claimed Egypt. He crowned himself Pharaoh. He established a dynasty that would last for 300 years, ending only with the death of Cleopatra. Ptolemy Soter, the savior, sat on his throne in the newly built royal quarter of Alexandria. He looked out at the Mediterranean, at the ships arriving from Athens and Rhodes, and he felt a profound anxiety. He knew that he was a Greek ruler in a foreign land. He knew that the legitimacy of his rule depended on prestige. He needed to prove that Alexandria was not just a trading post, but the true successor to Athens. He needed to prove that the torch of civilization had moved south across the water. He needed a project, something grander than a temple, something more enduring than a statue. It was a man named Demetrius of Phalerum who brought him the answer. Demetrius was an exile from Athens, a student of Aristotle's Lyceum, a philosopher who had fallen from grace and fled to Egypt for safety. He was a man who carried the dust of the Athenian schools on his sandals. He remembered the Lyceum, the walking paths, the collections of maps, the communal meals of the wise. Demetrius stood before Ptolemy in the cool, shadowed hall of the palace. Outside, the seagulls cried and the workmen hammered. But inside, Demetrius spoke of silence. He spoke of a museum, a temple to the muses, the 9 goddesses of inspiration. But this would not be a temple for prayer. It would be a temple for work. It would be a living community of scholars, poets, scientists, and astronomers, all paid by the royal purse, all fed and housed within the palace grounds, free from the need to earn a living. Their only duty would be to think, to research, to write. And to support them, Demetrius explained, they would need books, not just a few books, not just the personal collection of a king. They would need all the books. Demetrius proposed a vision of staggering ambition. He suggested that Ptolemy should attempt to collect every scroll, every text, every map, and every play that had ever been written by the hand of man. He proposed a universal library, a place where a scholar could stand in one room and hold the history of the entire human species in his hands. Ptolemy listened. He was a man who understood conquest. Alexander had conquered the earth. Ptolemy realized that he could conquer the mind. If he possessed all the knowledge of the world, he effectively possessed the world itself. Knowledge was leverage. Knowledge was power. Knowledge was divine. The king gave the nod. The treasury was opened. The order was given. And so, the great gathering began. Imagine the initial construction of the library complex. It was built within the Bruchaillon, the royal quarter. It was not a single building, but a campus. It was designed to integrate with the landscape, to blur the lines between the garden and the study. The architects laid foundations of deep granite. They erected colonnades of white marble, long hallways where the roof was supported by pillars, allowing the air to circulate freely. This was crucial. In the heat of Egypt, stillness meant rot. The scrolls needed to breathe. They needed the dry desert air to prevent the mold and the damp from eating the papyrus. The shelves were crafted from cedar wood, imported at great expense from the high mountains of Lebanon. Cedar was chosen for its oil, which naturally repelled the bookworms and beetles that feasted on literature. The carpenters worked in silence, planing the wood until it was smooth as glass, creating the niduses, the little cubby holes where the scrolls would rest. They built lecture halls with tiered seating, where the voice of a speaker could carry to the back row without shouting. They built dining halls where the scholars would break bread together. They built laboratories for dissection and observatories for watching the slow, clockwork turning of the stars. And connecting it all were the gardens. Lush green gardens fed by the waters of the Nile, filled with exotic plants and fountains that whispered in the heat of the afternoon. The library was designed to be a paradise, a place where the mind could unclench. As the physical structure neared completion, a strange hush seemed to fall over that quarter of the city. The soldiers stayed away. The merchants kept their noise to the harbor. The library was becoming a sacred space, a zone of neutrality in a violent world. It stood there, white and pristine against the blue sky, empty and waiting. It was a vast, hollow brain, waiting to be filled with memories. The shelves were bare, smelling of fresh resin and stone dust. The halls echoed with the footsteps of the first librarians. The vessel was ready. Now, they just needed the wine. Once the walls were erected and the cedar shelves polished to a golden sheen, the city of Alexandria began to breathe. It was a breath drawn in from the sea, a respiration of commerce and intellect. The city was laid out in a grid, a testament to Greek order, with the massive canopic way running through its center, a street 100 feet wide, lined with colonnades, where travelers from every corner of the known world walked in the shade. To walk down the Canopic Way in the twilight was to see the world in microcosm. You would see the robes of Persian mystics brushing against the tunics of Greek mathematicians. You would hear the guttural rhythms of Egyptian traders mingling with the lyrical cadence of Attic Greek. But above it all, looming over the harbor like a second moon, was the Pharos, the lighthouse of Alexandria. It is impossible to speak of the library without speaking of the lighthouse. They were the twin poles of the city, one guiding the ships, the other guiding the mind. The Pharos stood on its island, a tower of white stone rising hundreds of feet into the air, topped with a massive fire that burned day and night. Mirrors of polished bronze reflected the light so far out to sea that ships could see it from 30 miles away. It was a beacon of safety, and for the scholars of the library, it was a symbol. Just as the Pharos cut through the darkness of the ocean, the library was intended to cut through the darkness of ignorance. But a library is nothing without books, and the shelves, though beautiful, were hungry. Ptolemy II, the son of the founder, took up the mantle with an obsession that bordered on madness. He did not just want books, he wanted originals. He wanted the first drafts of the tragedies of Euripides. He wanted the star charts hand-drawn by the Babylonians. And so, the Ship's Fund was born. This was a royal decree, unique in the history of law. It stated that any ship docking in the harbor of Alexandria was subject to immediate search. But the soldiers who boarded these vessels were not looking for contraband wine or hidden gold. They were looking for scrolls. If a book was found on a ship, it was seized. It was taken immediately to the library. There, in the quiet scriptorium, armies of scribes, men with hands stained perpetually black with ink, would make a perfect copy of the text on fresh, high-quality papyrus. And then, in a move of supreme arrogance, the library would keep the original and give the copy back to the captain of the ship. They paid the captains, of course, and paid them well. But the message was clear. Alexandria keeps the truth. The rest of the world gets the echo. Imagine the accumulation. Scroll by scroll, the honeycomb of the library began to fill. They say there were eventually 500,000 scrolls, 500,000 distinct rolls of papyrus, stacked in the naduces, the pigeonholes. If you were to stand in the main hall during this era, the sensory experience would be overwhelming in its subtlety. You would hear the rustle of dried reeds as 1,000 scrolls were unfurled and furled again. You would smell the sharp, vinegar tang of the ink, the sweet resin of the cedar shelves, and the underlying salty humidity of the sea breeze drifting through the high windows. It was a fortress of silence. The city outside clamored with the noise of 1,000,000 souls, the shouts of the fishmongers, the rattle of chariot wheels, the prayers from the temples. But passed through the double doors of the library, and the world dropped away. Here, time moved differently. It moved at the speed of reading. It moved at the speed of thought. The scholars who lived here, the birds in the gilded cage, as some jealous poets called them, walked these halls with a slow, meditative gait. They ate together in the great dining hall. They walked in the botanical gardens, where plants from India and Spain grew side by side, just as the ideas of East and West grew side by side on the shelves. This was the dream of the king made manifest, a place where the sword was laid down and the pen was taken up, a place where the only conquest was the conquest of the unknown. As the sun set over the harbor, painting the white marble of the city in shades of violet and gold, the lamps in the library would be lit. Thousands of tiny flames illuminating the words of the dead. The library was open. The mind of the world was awake. Chapter 2. The Great Gathering, Part 1. The walls were built. The cedar shelves were waiting, breathing their resinous scent into the cool air. The librarians stood ready with their ink and their reed pens. But a library is a living organism, and like all living things, it requires sustenance. The Library of Alexandria fed on words, and so began one of the most singular eras in the history of human civilization, the Great Gathering. It was a time when the hunger for knowledge superseded the hunger for gold. The Ptolemaic kings, sitting on their thrones of ivory and gold in the Bruchion quarter, possessed an appetite that could not be sated by territory. They looked out across the blue expanse of the Mediterranean, not as conquerors of land, but as collectors of thought. They sent agents, the bibliocapilloi, out into the known world. These were not soldiers with swords, but scholars with purses heavy with silver drachmas. They boarded the merchant galleys bound for the great ports of antiquity. They sailed into the harbor of Rhodes, where the Colossus stood watch. They walked the dusty, sun-baked streets of Athens. They ventured into the markets of Antioch and the bazaars of the East. Their mission was simple, yet total. Buy everything. If a merchant possessed a treatise on the movement of the stars, the agents bought it. If a family held an old genealogy of a forgotten king, the agents bought it. If a traveler claimed to have a map of the coastline of India, the agents bought it. They did not care about the cost. They cared only about the completion of the collection. Imagine the arrival of these crates back in Alexandria. The ships would dock in the great harbor, their hulls creaking against the stone quays. The porters would unload heavy wooden chests, sealed with wax and rope, to protect the contents from the salt spray. These chests were carried through the bustling streets, past the noise of the fishmongers and the shouting of the chariot drivers, into the sacred silence of the library complex. There, the chests were pried open. The scent that escaped was the scent of the world, the dry dust of Greece, the incense of Persia, the damp clay of Mesopotamia. But mere purchasing was not enough. The ambition of the library soon curdled into a jealous obsession. Across the sea, in the city of Pergamon, another library was rising. The Attalid kings of Pergamon sought to rival the glory of Alexandria. They too were building shelves. They too were collecting scholars. Ptolemy did not tolerate rivals. In a move of bureaucratic warfare that echoes down through the ages, the king of Egypt placed an embargo on the export of papyrus. Egypt controlled the Nile Delta, the only place in the world where the papyrus reed grew in abundance. By cutting off the supply of paper, Ptolemy hoped to starve the library of Pergamon to death. He sought to freeze their pens, to leave their historians with nothing to write upon. It was a pettiness born of grandeur. But history has a way of turning obstacles into invention. Starved of papyrus, the scholars of Pergamon were forced to improvise. They began to refine the skins of sheep and calves, stretching them, scraping them, treating them with lime until they were thin and white and durable. They invented pergamon, parchment. And so, the rivalry between two kings gave the world the medium that would carry knowledge through the Middle Ages. But in Alexandria, papyrus remained king. The scrolls continued to pile up, a mountain of dry reeds inscribed with the ink of 1,000 minds. The acquisition methods became more aggressive. We have spoken of the ship's fund, the law that allowed the seizure of books from vessels. But the most famous story of the Great Gathering, the story that defines the ruthlessness of the Ptolemies, concerns the tragedians of Athens, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, desired the official authoritative texts of the three great playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were the crown jewels of Greek literature. The original manuscripts, handwritten by the masters or their direct scribes, were kept in the Athenian state archives, guarded like holy relics. They were the soul of Athens. Ptolemy sent ambassadors to Athens with a request. "Let us borrow the originals. We wish to copy them for our library. We will return them." The Athenians were wary. They knew the appetite of the Egyptian kings. They demanded an exorbitant deposit, 15 talents of silver, a fortune that could build a fleet of ships, as a guarantee that the scrolls would be returned. Ptolemy paid the silver without hesitation. The heavy chest of coins was left in the Parthenon. The scrolls were loaded onto a royal galley and sailed across the sea to Alexandria. Once they arrived, the scribes of the library set to work. They chose the finest grade of papyrus, the hieratic grade, smooth and pale. They mixed the blackest ink. They copied the plays with a precision that was breathtaking, matching line for line, word for word. And then Ptolemy made his choice. He sent the copies back to Athens. He kept the originals. He forfeited the 15 talents of silver. To him, the money was nothing. It was merely metal. But the manuscripts, the paper that had been touched by the hands of Sophocles, that was a treasure beyond price. The Athenians were furious, but there was nothing they could do. The books were in the inner citadel now. They belonged to the world's memory. This story illustrates the atmosphere of the library. It was a place of reverence, yes, but also a place of capture. It was a dragon's hoard, but instead of gold, the dragon sat upon a mountain of logic and poetry. Imagine walking through the intake room of the library during this period. It is a hive of quiet industry. The Galen scrolls, medical texts from the famous physician, are being unrolled and checked for errors. Star charts from Babylon, written on heavy clay tablets, are being transcribed onto lighter papyrus rolls for easier storage. The air is filled with the scratching of pens. It is a sound like insects in dry grass. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It is the sound of civilization backing itself up. Scholars from every nation moved through these halls. There were Jews from Judea, invited to translate their Torah into Greek, a project that would become the Septuagint. There were priests from the temples of the Nile, translating the ancient hieroglyphs into a history of Egypt. There were astronomers from Rhodes and mathematicians from Cyrene. They brought with them not just books, but the oral traditions of their people. They sat in the gardens, under the shade of palm trees and colonnades, debating the nature of the soul and the shape of the earth. The library became a melting pot, a crucible where the iron of one culture was forged with the copper of another to create a new alloy of wisdom. But amidst the acquisition, there was the challenge of order. How do you find a single poem in a pile of 500,000 scrolls? A library without a catalogue is just a pile of paper. And so, the task fell to a man named Callimachus. He was a poet scholar, a man with a mind like a filing cabinet. He looked at the chaos of the incoming ships, and he saw the need for structure. He began to write the pinnaces, the tables. It was the first library catalogue in history. Callimachus walked the endless rows of shelving. He picked up scroll after scroll. He read the first line, the incipit. He counted the lines. He noted the author, and he began to categorize, genre by genre, rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, medicine, mathematics. He was building a map of the human mind. He was drawing boundaries around the infinite, creating neighborhoods of thought. Before Callimachus, knowledge was a wild forest. After Callimachus, it was a cultivated garden. Imagine him there, late at night. The other scholars have gone to their beds. The oil lamp on his desk is burning low. The only sound is the distant wash of the sea against the harbor wall. He holds a scroll in his hand, perhaps a lost play by Aristophanes. He smells the dry papyrus. He dips his pen in the ink, and he writes the name of the book into the catalogue. In that moment, the book is saved. It is no longer a loose object drifting in the world. It has an address. It has a home. It can be found. There is a profound peace in this act of sorting. It is the peace of putting things where they belong. It is the peace of knowing that, even if the world outside is chaotic and unpredictable, inside these walls, everything is in its place. A place for everything, and everything in its place. The great gathering was not just about hoarding, it was about safeguarding. It was an act of defiance against the forgetfulness of time. The kings and the librarians knew that cities fall, that statues crumble, that memories fade. But they believed, perhaps naively, perhaps nobly, that if they could just gather enough words, they could build a fortress that time could not breach. And for a few hundred years, they were right. As you drift in the river of this history, feel the weight of those scrolls surrounding you. Rows and rows of them, a buffer of wisdom protecting you from the void. You are in the center of the collection. The knowledge of the world is standing guard over your sleep. You are safe among the shelves. Chapter 3. Inside the Walls. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the Great Library of Alexandria, one must first understand the nature of the transition. It was not merely a physical movement from a street into a building. It was a metaphysical crossing, a passage between two distinct and opposing worlds. Beyond the perimeter walls lay the city of Alexandria, in the high noon of its power. It was a cacophony of the living, a riotous, sweltering, vibrant explosion of sensory overload. The air outside was thick with the dust of the limestone quarries, the shouting of fishmongers in the markets, the rattling of iron-rimmed chariot wheels on paved avenues, and the polyglot hum of a dozen nations trading in the port. It was a city of heat, of blinding light, and of relentless, driving motion. But to approach the library was to leave this world behind. The entrance to the royal quarter, the Brucaillon, was marked by the Gate of the Sun, a towering archway of bronze and marble that stood open during the daylight hours, but was barred and guarded by the royal spearmen when the sun touched the western horizon. To step through this gate was to sever the cord that tied one to the chaos of the empire. The noise fell away, cut off as cleanly as if a heavy wool blanket had been dropped over the earth. In its place, a heavy, resonant silence descended. It was not an empty silence, cold and dead, but a living silence, pregnant with the weight of 1,000,000 thoughts waiting to be thought. The complex was known as the Museum, the Temple of the Muses. It was not a single structure, but a sprawling campus of wisdom, a city within a city, designed with a sacred geometry intended to mirror the order of the cosmos. It was a sanctuary where the architecture itself was designed to induce a state of trance and contemplation. Let us walk the grounds first, before we enter the halls of paper. The architects who designed these spaces were masters of the Egyptian climate. They understood that the mind cannot work if the body is under siege by the heat, and so they constructed the stoas, vast covered walkways that connected the buildings. These were long colonnades lined with pillars of white marble, quarried from the islands of the Aegean and floated across the sea. The pillars rose 40 feet into the air, smooth and cool to the touch, supporting roofs of cedar and tile. These walkways were oriented with mathematical precision to catch the Etesian winds, the consistent, cool breezes that blew south from the Mediterranean Sea. Even in the furnace of high summer, when the desert shimmered in the haze and the asphalt of the streets softened, the walkways of the library remained cool, swept by a perpetual gentle draught that smelled of salt and jasmine. Between the colonnades lay the gardens. These were not the wild, untamed jungles of the south, but cultivated paradises, examples of man's dominion over nature. The Ptolemaic kings, in their obsessive desire to catalogue the world, collected plants just as they collected books. There were botanical gardens filled with medicinal herbs from the Levant, balsam trees from Judea, and strange fern-like plants brought back from the edges of India. The ground here was soft, covered in moss and clover, irrigated by a complex system of canals that drew water from the Nile. To walk here was to walk through a living encyclopedia of botany. Lotus flowers drifted in rectangular reflecting pools, their white petals opening to the sun. The shadows of date palms stretched long and serrated across the grass. The sound of water was the heartbeat of the exterior grounds. Fountains, fed by hydraulic systems engineered by the greatest minds of the age, Ctesibius and Hero, bubbled in the courtyards. This water served a dual purpose. It cooled the air through evaporation, but it also created a curtain of white noise. It was a sonic barrier, a gentle, rhythmic rushing that masked the distant hum of the metropolis. It allowed the scholars to walk in deep contemplation, undisturbed by the trivialities of the empire. A mathematician could pace the length of the garden, muttering equations, and hear nothing but the water and the wind in the palm fronds. Scattered throughout these gardens were the statues. They were the silent inhabitants of the museum, lifelike busts of Homer, of Socrates, of Plato, carved from marble so white it seemed to glow in the twilight. They lined the paths like sentinels, staring out with blank stone eyes, reminding the living scholars that they were walking in the company of giants. It was a place where the past was more real than the present, but the true soul of the complex lay indoors. Let us approach the main building now. It was a monolithic structure of limestone, approached by a wide flight of shallow steps. The doors were made of cypress wood, bound in bronze, heavy and balanced on pivots so well oiled that they could be pushed open with the pressure of a single finger. To enter the great hall, the bibliotheca, was to enter the cavern of the human mind. It was a space of immense verticality, the ceiling vaulted high overhead, lost in the shadows. It was painted a deep midnight blue and adorned with gold leaf stars, a physical representation of the heavens that the astronomers studied by night. To look up was to look into the infinite. The air inside was different. It was dry, kept intentionally free of humidity to protect the fragile organic materials of the collection. It smelled of time. It was a complex, layered perfume, the sharp, clean, resinous scent of cedar wood, the dry, dusty aroma of aging papyrus, the faint metallic tang of iron gall ink, and the beeswax used to polish the floors. It was the smell of preservation. The lighting here was a feat of engineering. The architects knew that the harsh, direct sunlight of Egypt was the enemy of ink. It would bleach the letters and make the papyrus brittle. And so, there were no low windows. Instead, the room was lit by clerestory windows, high openings near the roofline, shielded by alabaster screens. These allowed the light to enter and bounce against the white limestone walls, diffusing into a soft, shadowless glow. It was a world of perpetual dawn. Inside the great hall, the sun never seemed to set and never seemed to rise. It was simply light, suspended and eternal. In this ambient glow, the dust motes danced. You could see them, millions of tiny particles floating in the shafts of light, suspended in the still air. The dust of Egypt, the dust of the scrolls, the dust of the scholars' robes. They turned slowly in the air, a microscopic galaxy. The walls were lined not with the dark, heavy bookcases of a later age, but with the kibotoi, wooden chests and shelving units crafted from cedar. The choice of cedar was deliberate. Imported at great expense from the mountains of Lebanon, the wood contained natural oils that repelled the bookworms and beetles that feasted on paper. The shelves stretched from the floor to the height of a man's reach, and then above that, a gallery level, accessed by wooden ladders on wheels. The books themselves did not stand upright. They lay on their sides. They were scrolls, long rolls of papyrus or parchment, wound tightly around wooden or bone dowels. Each scroll was tucked into a nidus, a nest or pigeonhole in the shelving. From the end of each scroll hung a small tag of leather or wood, the syllabos. This tag bore the title of the work and the name of the author. Looking down the endless length of the hall, one would see thousands upon thousands of these tags, dangling like leaves in a dense forest. A forest of knowledge, a forest where the voices of the dead waited to speak. Along the center of the great hall ran long tables of polished oak, worn smooth by the elbows of generations of thinkers. Here, the silence was absolute. It was a dense silence, absorbent and heavy. The scholars did not sit in chairs as we do. They often stood at high lecterns or sat on low stools, hunched over the unrolled texts. Watch a scholar at work in your mind's eye. He moves with a deliberate, practiced slowness. He pulls a scroll from its nest. He unties the linen ribbon that binds it. He places it on the table. With one hand, he unrolls the text to reveal a column of writing. With the other, he rolls up the portion he has read. Reveal, conceal, reveal, conceal. It is a continuous flowing motion, like the river of time itself. The only sound in the room is the dry crackle of the reeds as the scrolls are turned, a sound like autumn leaves blowing across stone. Separated from the main reading room by thick walls of stone lay the scriptorium. If the great hall was the mind of the library, the scriptorium was its hands. This was the engine room of production. Here, the silence was replaced by the low, rhythmic sound of industry. Rows of scribes sat at slanted desks. These were men with callous fingers, stained perpetually black with ink. Their task was endless and repetitive. They took the crumbling, worm-eaten texts acquired from the ships and transferred their souls into new bodies. They copied the plays of Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus, and the star charts of Babylon onto fresh, high-grade hieratic papyrus. They mixed their ink from soot, gum, and water in small clay pots. They sharpened their reed pens with small bronze knives. Dip, right, dip, right. The sound of the scriptorium was the sound of 1,000 pens scratching against paper. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of civilization backing itself up, line by line, letter by letter. It was a hive of quiet defiance against the erasure of time. Every stroke of the pen was a victory against forgetfulness. Beyond the halls of study lay the oikos, the house of living. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a workplace. It was a monastery before the concept existed. The scholars, the members of the museum, lived within the walls. They slept in simple cells, small rooms with stone floors and narrow beds, waking before the sun to the sound of the temple bells. They ate together in a massive communal dining hall. Imagine the scene of the evening meal. Long tables lit by the warm, flickering glow of oil lamps. Simple food served on clay platters. Barley bread, figs, dried fish from the harbor. Wine diluted with water. The conversation here was the most rarefied on earth. A mathematician from Cyrene might break bread with a poet from Rhodes and an anatomist from Alexandria. They debated the nature of the soul, the circumference of the earth, and the grammar of Homer. The air hummed with the low, convivial murmur of shared intellect. They were a brotherhood, separated from the world by their privilege and their burden. They were fed by the king, protected by the king's soldiers, and exempt from the taxes that crushed the common man. They had no duties other than to think, to remember, to keep the flame alive. As night descended fully over the city, the atmosphere of the library changed once more. Outside, the city of Alexandria descended into the chaotic darkness of the ancient world. The taverns by the port filled with sailors. The streets became dangerous. But inside the walls, the order held. The great bronze doors were barred. The oil lamps in the hallways were trimmed to a low glow, casting long, dancing shadows against the columns. The scrolls were returned to their nests, sleeping in the cedar-scented dark. The vast stone halls stood empty, save for the watchmen who walked the perimeter, their sandals slapping softly against the stone. In the darkness, the building itself seemed to breathe, a slow, heavy respiration of stone and paper. It stood as a fortress against the chaos of the night, a container for the human spirit. Inside these walls, the wars of the outside world did not matter. The rise and fall of dynasties did not matter. The price of grain did not matter. Here, in the cool shadows, the past was safe. The memory of the species was secure, resting in the quiet dark, waiting for the light of the morning. You are standing there now, in the center of the darkened hall. You are alone, but you are not lonely. You are surrounded by the presence of 1,000,000 friends, 1,000,000 teachers, sleeping on the shelves. The air is still. The dust is settling. The silence is a blanket. You are inside the walls. You are safe. Chapter 4. The Keepers of Wisdom. A great building, no matter how thick its walls or how soaring its columns, is nothing without a custodian. A temple requires a priest to tend the fire. A fortress requires a commander to walk the ramparts. And the Great Library of Alexandria, which was at once a temple to the Muses and a fortress of human thought, required a new breed of guardian to stand watch over the silence. They were known as the prostates, the head librarians. To hold this title was to hold one of the most singular and powerful positions in the ancient world. The head librarian was not merely a clerk or a sorter of paper. He was appointed by the king himself. He was the tutor to the royal children, the heir apparents of the Ptolemaic dynasty. He was the supreme arbiter of truth in an empire built on words. In a world where information was scattered, chaotic, and often contradictory, the man who held the keys to the library held the power to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. The first of these great keepers was Zenodotus of Ephesus. Imagine him walking the cool, shadowed colonnades in the early years of the 3rd century BC. He was a tall man, severe in intellect, a grammarian who looked at the sprawling, messy heritage of Greek literature, not with awe, but with a critical eye. He saw the chaos of the collection, and he saw the need for a knife. Zenodotus did not just collect books, he purified them. Before the rise of Alexandria, the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, existed in 1,000 different versions. They had been sung by bards for centuries, around campfires and in banquet halls. They had been changed with every telling, filled with errors, local additions, and lines that had drifted in from other stories. The Homeric texts that arrived on the ships from Athens and Rhodes were a tangled web of variations. Zenodotus took these hundreds of conflicting scrolls and laid them side by side on the long oak tables of the great hall. In the deep quiet of the scriptorium, under the light of oil lamps, he began the monumental work of comparison. He read line by line, hunting for the true voice of Homer. He looked for consistency. He looked for the meter. When he found a line that he believed was spurious, a fake addition by a lesser poet, he did not burn the scroll. He was a librarian, not a censor. Instead, he took his reed pen and made a simple mark in the margin of the text. The obolus, a horizontal line, a dagger. It was a silent act of editing that would echo through the next 2,000 years of history. With a simple stroke of ink, he defined the canon of Western literature. He brought order to the chaos of oral tradition. He decided which words belonged to the master and which were merely noise. But as the ships continued to dock in the great harbor, and the agents of the Ships Fund continued to seize cargoes of books from every corner of the Mediterranean, a new and terrifying problem arose. The sheer volume of knowledge was becoming unmanageable. The library possessed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. They were piled in the niduses, the cedar pigeonholes, like grain in a silo. There were mountains of poetry, rivers of history, oceans of mathematics. Without a map, this ocean of information was useless. A scholar could spend a lifetime wandering the labyrinth of shelves, looking for a single play by Euripides, and never find it. The library needed a map. It needed a mind capable of categorizing the universe. Enter Callimachus of Cyrene. Callimachus was not a head librarian, yet his shadow lies longer over the history of the library than any king or general. He was a poet-scholar, a man of precise and exacting tastes. He famously said, "A big book is a big evil." He preferred short, polished, perfect verses. He hated disorder. He hated the sprawling mess of the uncatalogued mind. He looked at the mountain of scrolls, and he began the monumental task of the pinarchs, the tables of persons. Eminent in every branch of learning, it was the world's first library catalogue. Imagine the scene of this labor. It is late at night. The other scholars have gone to their beds in the oikos. The wind from the sea is rattling the bronze gates outside. Callimachus sits at his desk, surrounded by mounds of small wooden tags and scraps of papyrus. The oil lamp flickers, casting long, dancing shadows against the limestone walls. He is building a structure, but not of stone. He is building a structure of logic. He began to divide the authors into classes, creating neighborhoods of thought: rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, mathematics. He listed the authors alphabetically, a revolutionary innovation at the time, a system of ordering that we still use today. He counted the lines of their works to ensure that future copyists did not delete sections. He wrote brief biographies of the authors, distinguishing between men who shared the same name. He created a system where any book, no matter how obscure, could be located within minutes by a junior scribe. The Pinax grew to be 120 scrolls long. It was a book about books. It was the central nervous system of the library. This work was tedious. It was quiet. It was endless. But in the context of the ancient world, it was a magical act. It tamed the wildness of human thought. It turned a pile of paper into a library. It allowed the mind to navigate the sum of human knowledge without getting lost. The men who lived and worked here were known formally as the members of the museum. They were a strange, cloistered society, existing in a bubble of privilege within the bustling city. They were fed by the palace kitchens. They were exempt from the taxes that crushed the common merchants of the city. They had no duties other than to think, to read, and to teach. They were the first professors, the first tenured academics in history. The satirist Timon of Phlius mocked them, calling them bookish scribblers who were fattened up in the coop of the muses. He described them arguing endlessly in the birdcage of the library, fighting over the definitions of words while the world outside prepared for war. But this mockery misses the profound beauty of their existence. In a world defined by violence, by the clash of the Macedonian phalanx and the sacking of cities, the library was a zone of peace. It was a sanctuary where the only battles fought were battles of logic. Imagine the daily rhythm of a librarian in the golden age of Alexandria. He wakes before dawn in his quarters within the palace complex. The air is cool, carrying the scent of the Nile Delta. He washes in a basin of water brought by servants. He dresses in a simple tunic of linen. He eats a breakfast of figs, bread, and cheese in the communal dining hall, nodding silently to a mathematician from Sicily or an astronomer from Rhodes. He walks to the great hall. The sun is just touching the tops of the white columns, turning the marble to gold. The air smells of the sea and the drying ink of the scriptorium. He spends the morning teaching. The library was also a university, and the sons of kings and nobles were sent here to learn the arts of logic and rhetoric. The librarian sits in the exedra, the curved stone bench, and speaks of the nature of the atom, or the history of the Peloponnesian War, or the geometry of the sphere. His voice is low, measured, echoing softly against the marble. In the afternoon, the heat of the day rises. The city sleeps, but the librarian retreats into the cool, shadowed aisles of the stacks. He is hunting for a reference. He pulls a scroll from its nest, a treatise on botany from Theophrastus. He unrolls it carefully. The papyrus is yellow and brittle. It crackles softly, a sound like dry leaves in autumn. He reads. He takes notes on a wax tablet with a stylus. He is engaged in the great conversation, speaking with the dead across the centuries. This was a life of profound regularity. It was a monastic existence dedicated to the worship of the written word. The librarians viewed themselves as the guardians of a sacred flame. They believed that if they stopped working, if they stopped copying, if they stopped cataloging, the flame would go out. The darkness of ignorance would return to swallow the world. They were right to be worried. We know now how fragile this knowledge was. We know that papyrus rots in the damp. We know that fire burns. We know that insects eat the words of kings. We know that of the 120 plays of Sophocles that once sat on these shelves, only 7 have survived to reach us. But in that moment, in the high summer of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the flame burned bright. The library was not just a collection, it was a machine for thinking. It attracted the greatest minds like a magnet. Apollonius of Rhodes, the author of the epic Jason and the Argonauts, walked these halls as head librarian. Eratosthenes, the man who measured the circumference of the world with a stick and a shadow, succeeded him. And there was Aristophanes of Byzantium. He was a librarian who dedicated his life to the mechanics of reading. Before Aristophanes, Greek was written as a solid block of letters, scriptio continua. There were no spaces between words, no periods, no commas. It was a breathless, unbroken stream of data that was incredibly difficult to read. Aristophanes, in the quiet of his study, invented the system of punctuation and accents. He introduced the dot to mark the end of a sentence. He introduced the breathing marks to guide the pronunciation. He introduced the pause. Think of that contribution. The ability to pause. The ability to break a thought into manageable pieces. It is a gift of silence, inserted into the noise of language. It was born here, in the quiet study of a librarian who wanted to make the voice of Homer clear to the eye. These men were not merely curators, they were gardeners. They pruned the texts. They watered the roots of knowledge. They grafted new ideas onto old stocks. They cultivated the garden of the mind so that future generations could eat the fruit. And they did it all in a profound, enveloping isolation. The city of Alexandria was a riot of color and sound. The festivals of Dionysus, the processions of the elephants, the bells of the temples. But the librarians were separate. They lived in the inner citadel of the city. They moved through the years with the slow, turning precision of a page being turned. Scroll by scroll, shelf by shelf, dynasty by dynasty. As you listen to this history, imagine yourself as one of these keepers. You are standing at the end of a long aisle of books. The smell of cedar is thick in the air. The dust motes are dancing in the shaft of light from the high window. You hold a scroll in your hand. It feels heavy, dense with thought. You place it into its niche. You check the wooden tag. It is in its rightful place. The world is in order. There is nothing to fear here. The past is safe. The knowledge is secure. You are the watcher on the wall, and the night is quiet. The work is done for the day. The catalogue is complete. Rest now in the shadow of the shelves. Rest in the order of the pinnacles. The chaotic world has been sorted, labeled, and put away. There is only the silence of the books. Chapter 5. The Great Discoveries. The library was not merely a tomb for the thoughts of the dead. It was a laboratory for the living. Within the silence of the colonnades, amidst the scent of cedar and papyrus, the human mind began to stretch its limbs. It began to measure the immeasurable. Of all the ghosts that walk these halls, none is more significant, nor more emblematic of the Alexandrian spirit, than Eratosthenes of Cyrene. He was the third head librarian, a man nicknamed Beta by his jealous rivals, meaning second best at everything, but known to history as the father of geography. While the poets argued over the meter of a verse in the dining hall, Eratosthenes looked out the window at the shadows cast by the pillars. He was not looking at words. He was looking at the geometry of the world. The story of his great discovery is a story of profound stillness. It did not require a fleet of ships or an army of surveyors. It required only a stick, a shadow, and a mind capable of silence. Eratosthenes had read a report in the library archives, a dry, administrative scroll from the city of Syene, far to the south, near the first cataract of the Nile. The report mentioned a curious phenomenon. On the summer solstice at high noon, the sun shone directly to the bottom of a deep well. There was no shadow. The walls of the well were illuminated perfectly. Eratosthenes sat in his study in Alexandria, hundreds of miles to the north. He waited for the solstice. When the hour of noon arrived, he did not look into a well. He planted a simple vertical stick, a gnomon, into the ground of the library garden. He watched. He waited. The sun beat down on the white marble. The silence of the noon hour was heavy. At the exact moment when the sun was overhead, he measured the shadow cast by the stick. In Syene, there was no shadow, but here, in Alexandria, there was a shadow. It measured 7.2 degrees. In that quiet moment, in the privacy of a garden, the size of the earth was captured. Eratosthenes realized that the surface of the world was curved. By calculating the distance between the two cities and the angle of the shadow, he calculated the circumference of the planet. He did this without leaving the library. He did this with pure logic. He arrived at a figure of 252,000 stadia, a number that is breathtakingly close to the actual size of the Earth, as we know it today. Think of the magnitude of that quietude. A man standing alone in a garden, looking at a shadow on the sand, and holding the entire sphere of the world in his mind. It was a victory of stillness. It was a testament to what the mind can do when it is given peace, when it is protected from the noise of survival. But the discoveries were not limited to the earth beneath their feet. The scholars of the museum also turned their eyes upward, to the great deep of the night sky. The library possessed an observatory. We do not know exactly where it stood, perhaps on a high tower near the palace, or perhaps on the roof of the great hall itself. But we can imagine the scene. At night, when the lamps in the reading rooms were extinguished, the astronomers would ascend. Men like Aristarchus of Samos, and later Hipparchus. They climbed the stone stairs into the cool night air, leaving the sleeping city below them. Alexandria at night was a dark place, save for the fire of the Pharos Lighthouse sweeping the harbor. The sky above was a pristine tapestry of diamond dust. The air was clear, stripped of the humidity of the day. Here, in the dark, they stood watch. They were the night sentinels of humanity. They did not have telescopes. They had only their eyes and simple instruments of brass and wood, quadrants and astrolabes. They measured the positions of the stars with infinite patience. Night after night, year after year. They tracked the wanderers, the planetae, recording their strange looping paths across the zodiac. It was Aristarchus walking these roofs who first whispered the dangerous thought that the earth was not the center, that the fire of the sun was the hearth of the universe, and we were merely revolving around it. It was a thought too vast for the time, a seed planted in the dark that would not germinate for another 1,000 years. But the act of observation was a meditation in itself. To chart the stars is to submit to a timescale that makes human life seem like a flicker of a candle. Imagine the silence of the astronomer. He stands motionless, his eye fixed on the horizon, waiting for the moment a specific star rises from the sea. He marks the time with a water clock, the steady drip, 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 measuring the rotation of the heavens. He writes the coordinates on a wax tablet. He is building a map of the infinite. He is calm. He is cold. He is detached from the passions of the earth. Up here, there are no wars. There are no famines. There is only the mathematical perfection of the spheres. While the astronomers looked up, others looked inward. The library was also the birthplace of medical science. For the first time in history, the taboo against opening the human body was lifted. In the quiet, sterile rooms of the museum, Herophilus and Erasistratus began to map the geography of the human form. They were the cartographers of the flesh. They worked in the cool mornings. They dissected the eye and found the retina. They traced the delicate white threads of the nerves, realizing for the first time that these were the conduits of sensation, the wiring that connected the brain to the world. They distinguished the veins from the arteries. They described the valves of the heart. It was gruesome work, perhaps, but in the context of the library, it was done with a reverent curiosity. It was a search for the seat of the soul. Herophilus measured the pulse. He built a water clock calibrated to fit inside a portable case, so he could measure the rhythm of the heart against the rhythm of time. He realized that the pulse was not a random fluttering. but a musical tempo, systole and diastole. Think of the intimacy of that discovery. A scholar sitting by a bedside in the quiet infirmary, his fingers resting gently on the wrist of a patient, counting the beats. Thump, 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 listening to the engine of life. He categorized the pulses: the ant-crawling pulse, the gazelle pulse, the caprisant, or leaping pulse. He turned the chaotic noise of the body into a catalogue, just as Callimachus had turned the chaotic noise of literature into a catalogue. Everything in Alexandria was about order. It was about taking the messy, frightening, overwhelming nature of reality and placing it into a structure that the mind could understand. There is a deep comfort in this. It suggests that the world is knowable. It suggests that if we just sit quietly enough and look closely enough, the mysteries will resolve themselves into facts. The library was also a place of machines. It was here that Ctesibius, the father of pneumatics, played with the properties of air and water. He sat in his workshop, surrounded by bronze pipes and glass vessels. He discovered that air was a substance, that it had elasticity. He built the hydraulis, the water organ. Imagine the sound of it echoing through the stone halls, the first musical instrument played by the pressure of water. A haunting, fluid sound, like a choir of whales singing in the deep. He built water clocks that could track the hours of the night with perfect precision, dropping a single pebble into a bronze bowl every hour. Clink. A sound that marked the passing of the watch. Hero of Alexandria, centuries later, would build steam engines and automatic doors that opened by firelight. These were toys, yes, but they were toys that proved the universe ran on rules. The great discoveries of Alexandria were not loud. They were not announced with trumpets. They happened in the quiet corners. They happened when Euclid sat in the sand, drawing a perfect circle, proving that the geometry of the world was consistent. They happened when Archimedes, who studied here as a young man, watched the water rise in his bath and understood displacement. They happened when the translators of the Septuagint sat in their separate cells on the island of Pharos, turning the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, bridging the gap between Jerusalem and Athens. This was the golden afternoon of the ancient mind. It was a time when the barriers between disciplines were thin. A poet could be a geographer, a doctor could be an astronomer. The library held it all together. As you drift deeper into relaxation, imagine yourself wandering through these halls of discovery. You walk past the room of the mapmakers, where parchment charts of the known world are spread out on tables, weighted down with stones. You see the outline of the Mediterranean, the curve of Africa, the mystery of the Atlantic. You walk past the room of the mathematicians, where the air is thick with concentration. You see diagrams of triangles and spheres drawn in charcoal on the walls. You walk past the observatory, where the astronomers are packing away their instruments as the first light of dawn touches the sky. You feel the collective brain power of the human race surrounding you. It is a hum, a vibration in the air. But it is not a restless energy. It is a grounded, heavy energy. It is the energy of a foundation being laid. These men built the floor upon which we stand today. They measured the earth so we would not be lost. They named the stars so we would not be alone in the dark. They mapped the body so we would understand our own pain. They did the work so you do not have to. The questions have been asked. The measurements have been taken. The books have been written. You do not need to solve the riddle of the universe tonight. Eratosthenes has already measured it. Herophilus has already mapped the pulse. Euclid has already proven the theorems. You can rest in their labor. You can sleep in the house they built. The stars are turning overhead, charted and known. The earth is curved and stable beneath your bed. The heart in your chest is beating its familiar, ancient rhythm, systole, diastole, just as it has since the beginning of time. Everything is known. Everything is held. The library protects the knowledge. The night protects you. Chapter 6. The Twilight and the Eternal Memory. All things made of matter are subject to the laws of decay. It is the iron rule of the cosmos. Stone weathers, wood rots, papyrus crumbles. Even the stars themselves burn down to embers given enough time. And so, it was inevitable that the golden afternoon of Alexandria would eventually give way to the twilight. It did not happen in a single day. The legends tell us of a great fire, of Julius Caesar setting the harbor aflame, of the library burning in a single, catastrophic night. But the truth is slower, quieter, and perhaps more poignant. The library did not vanish in a flash of dramatic destruction. It faded, it eroded, like a cliff face battered by the ceaseless waves of the centuries. Let us move forward in time now. The Ptolemaic dynasty has fallen. Cleopatra, the last queen, has departed into history. The Romans have arrived. The atmosphere of the Brucheion Quarter has changed. The silence of the scholarship is still there, but it has acquired a different quality. It is no longer the silence of anticipation. It is the silence of preservation. The air feels older. The light seems to slant more steeply through the clerestory windows. Walk through the great hall in this later era. You can see the age on the faces of the librarians. They are no longer just collecting. They are frantically copying. The papyrus from the early days is becoming brittle. The humidity of the delta is winning the war against the cedar wood. The scholars are engaged in a race against time, trying to transfer the wisdom of the ancients onto new parchment, onto vellum, trying to save what can be saved. There is a melancholy beauty in this decline. It is the beauty of autumn. The leaves are turning gold and brown, preparing to fall. The great fire of 48 BC was a wound, yes. When Caesar was besieged in the palace complex, he set fire to his own ships in the harbor to block the Egyptian fleet. The fire leapt from the rigging of the triremes to the warehouses on the docks. It consumed the grain. It consumed the bundles of scrolls waiting to be catalogued. Smoke drifted through the white colonnades of the library. Ash fell like grey snow on the botanical gardens. The scholars stood on the roof of the museum, watching the orange glow reflecting off the water, weeping silently. 40,000 scrolls were lost that night. But the library itself survived. The heart of the collection remained. The fire was a scar, a reminder of the fragility of thought in a world of swords. But as the centuries wore on, the world outside the walls became less interested in the stars and more interested in dogma. The Roman Empire slowly fractured. The funding from the emperors dried up. The ship's fund was empty. There were no more agents scouring the markets of Athens for new plays. The intake room stood empty and dusty. The population of the museum began to dwindle. The great communal dining hall, once filled with the clamor of debate, grew quiet. There were empty seats at the long tables. The lamps were not lit as often. The library was shrinking. It was retracting into itself, like a dying star. Yet even in the twilight, there were moments of brilliance. There was Hypatia, the mathematician and philosopher, the daughter of the last great librarian Theon. She walked these halls in the 4th century AD, a solitary figure in a philosopher's cloak. She taught astronomy and the geometry of conic sections in the lecture halls that echoed with the ghosts of Eratosthenes and Euclid. She was the last guardian of the old flame. She represented the final, stubborn refusal of the intellect to surrender to the gathering dark. Imagine her sitting in the observatory at night. The city of Alexandria has changed around her. The old temples are being dismantled. The statues are being toppled. But up here, the stars are the same. The mathematics is the same. The truth has not changed, even if the world has stopped listening to it. There is a profound peace in that realization. The truth does not require an audience to be true. The Pythagorean theorem is valid, whether 1 million people know it or only one. Hypatia knew this, and so she continued to teach. She continued to write. She continued to keep the watch. But the tide of history is a force that cannot be held back by gates of bronze. The end came in stages, a slow dissolution. The Serapeum, the daughter library in the southern part of the city, was closed. The scholars dispersed. The scrolls were scattered. Some were hidden in clay jars and buried in the desert caves, waiting for the future. Some were carried away by fleeing monks to the monasteries of the desert. Some were simply left on the shelves, where the damp sea air slowly turned the words of Sappho and Menander into dust. It is a tragedy, yes, but in the context of deep time, it is also a release. The library had done its work. It had held the light for 700 years. It had acted as a bridge across the abyss of the ancient world. It had allowed the mind of Greece to touch the mind of Rome, and the mind of Rome to touch the mind of the future. A seed does not last forever. It must break open to release the life inside. The library broke open, the containment field failed, and the knowledge spilled out into the world. It flowed into the Arab scholars who would translate Aristotle in Baghdad. It flowed into the Byzantine monks who would copy Plato in Constantinople. It flowed into the Renaissance of Italy. The building crumbled. The limestone blocks were hauled away to build seawalls and fortresses. The cedar wood rotted. The site was lost. Today, the modern city of Alexandria sits on top of the ancient one, a layer of concrete over a layer of dreams. But the idea of the library did not die. The idea of a universal memory, that is the ghost that still haunts us. That is the dream we are still trying to build. As you lie here in the dark, listening to the echo of this history, feel the weight of that legacy. You are the heir to those scrolls. The fact that you know the name Marcus Aurelius, the fact that you know the circumference of the earth, the fact that you can read, these are the gifts that survived the fire. They traveled through the smoke. They traveled through the dark ages. They traveled across oceans of time to reach you. And now they are yours. You hold them in your mind. You are the current vessel. We are at the end of the story now. The city of white marble has faded into the mist. The lighthouse has fallen into the sea, its stones resting beneath the waves of the harbor. The voices of the scholars have fallen silent. We are left only with the atmosphere, the feeling of the place. Imagine the sight of the library as it might have looked after the end. The ruins are silent under the moon. The wind blows through the broken colonnades, whistling a low, mournful tune. The sand has begun to drift in, covering the mosaic floors. The date palms have grown wild, their fronds rustling in the sea breeze. It is not a place of sadness. It is a place of profound rest. The struggle is over. The effort to catalogue the universe has ceased. The books have returned to the elements. Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. This is true for men, and it is true for books. The paper has returned to the reeds of the Nile. The ink has returned to the soot of the earth. The thoughts have returned to the great, swirling consciousness of humanity. There is a peace in completion. There's a peace in knowing that everything has a season. The library had its spring, its summer, its autumn, and now its eternal winter. Let your mind walk among these ruins. Touch the weathered stone of a fallen pillar. It is still warm from the day's sun. Look out through the empty archway at the Mediterranean Sea. It is the same sea. It washes against the shore with the same rhythm. Wash in, wash out. The sea does not mourn the library. The sea simply continues. And you must continue now, too. You must continue into the country of sleep. You have walked the long halls. You have smelled the cedar and the papyrus. You have sat with the Stoics and the astronomers. You have carried the weight of history for the last few hours. Now, you can lay it down. Imagine that you are holding the last scroll. It is the story of your own day. It contains all the thoughts, all the worries, all the lists of things you have to do. Walk to the end of the ruined pier. Stand by the edge of the dark water. Throw the scroll into the sea. Watch it hit the water. Watch it sink. The ink dissolves. The paper disintegrates. The words vanish. It is gone. You are free. The history of the world is heavy, but sleep is light. Sleep is the absence of history. Sleep is the place where there are no dates, no names, no wars, no libraries. There is only the soft, rhythmic pulse of existence. You are drifting away from Alexandria now. The white city is shrinking in the distance, glowing faintly in the starlight. You are drifting out into the open ocean of the night. The water is calm. The air is still. The stars are overhead, the same stars that Eratosthenes mapped, looking down on you with their cold, indifferent kindness. They are telling you that it is time to rest. They are telling you that the universe is holding you, and you do not need to understand it to be part of it. Close the eyes of the mind. Let the white stone fade. Let the firelight fade. There is only the sound of the rain now, the eternal rain, washing the world clean, washing the mind clean. Listen to it. It is the sound of peace. It is the sound of the end of the story. There is nothing left to learn tonight. There is nothing left to remember. You are safe. You are whole. You are asleep.